Uh, I am Jonathan McDougall. I'm a program specialist with the AGU's Publications Department. I work with journals Paleoceanography and Paleoclimatology and Geophysical Research Letters. We're here to talk about accessibility in science. Tonight I have with me Dr. Gabriel Filippelli, Dr. Rodrigo Vargas, Dr. Alexander Moore, and Dr. Catherine Orelly. Thank you for volunteering your time and for contributing your insights to this discussion. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I had a couple of questions that I'd like to get the discussion moving with. Just this one's general. What is the most valuable step, in your opinion, in making science more accessible to the public?
Am I gonna have to be the one that breaks the ice?
Yes.
I'll go ahead and jump in. Yeah, I was thinking about this a little while ago. I think it's largely the public. I think we have to think of how you explain your work to a non-expert friend so that they would understand not just what you do, but why you're doing it and why anyone should care. I think people assume that scientists are this dispassionate observers of the world and separate somehow from the rest of them. But I think it's really important to show the human nature of scientific discovery, and and the fact that it's a really creative process and one fraught with a lot of disappointments and a few amazing discoveries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And one skill is how we synthesize complex information, because it's not useful to say, well, this is very, very difficult to understand and therefore you're not going to get it. No, that is a bad attitude. I think one of the biggest challenges is how we take that complex information that we're passionate about and we are discovering fantastic things, but put it in a simple way so people can understand why we're doing that, and put it into context where people understand why we asked that question in the first place, and then where are we after finding or after discussing the discoveries or what we learned from that phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that approach works for even talking to other scientists, actually, because, if you're engaged, you'll ask more questions, right? And when I first started giving talks, even at scientific conferences, I actually thought about my 15-year-old sister. So I was a graduate student. She was 15-year-old, and she was very smart, right? But she was not going to understand the complexities of my science. And I actually kind of structured my conference talks with her in mind. And I did win awards at AGU for those talks. So just getting down to the kernels of what's exciting and interesting, and not worrying so much about trying to explain all the complex stuff makes things much more accessible.
Excellent.
One thing I would suggest, I mean, I'm assuming we're all right. We're starting from a platform of open access, which journals like GeoHealth are great examples of, and I've had the pleasure of working with them. And I think if you don't start from open access, you're not going anywhere. You're reducing your audience to a very small percentage. It's just as simple as that. And I think personally, I would boil down the major things that we need to do to three, and that's reporters. You have to be able to speak to reporters, and just like you speak to a 15-year-old, you can speak to a reporter, and an intelligible language that they can take down in quotes. And I mean, really write down your quotes before you talk to a reporter. It's a simple trick. Say it over and over again to yourself, and no, that's a 15-letter word. Nobody's gonna know that. And just smack yourself in the head every time you do that, and make it intelligible. And the second thing is, know who you're talking to, and that doesn't just mean 15-year-olds and reporters. It means also take a look at what the polls say, what people are thinking. We have enormous amounts of data about what people are thinking in terms of climate change or public health, which is what I work on. any other data point. Google it, see what else has been written about. Even Google image it and see what comes up in the collective hive mind of the world in terms of your topic, and then hook onto that. Because if you go with the familiar, then you can build on something more complex. And the last thing again is graphics. If you are on social media or you are even publishing, and you do a comment or you do a review or some sort of explanatory article of some kind, graphics are your friends. You have a 7-second attention span average in America. You got to fix those graphics. If you don't have beautiful graphics, you don't have infographics, you don't have something that just, boom, hooks somebody up, you're losing an enormous opportunity.
Thank you for your answers. My next question, I'm actually, Alex, I'm glad you brought up social media, very relevant for my next question. I want to talk about what skills you would each encourage early career scientists to develop and what resources you would recommend to them. And particularly, if you would include media literacy, particularly social media literacy, among those skills. For this talk, I was reviewing the case of Lucas Zeppetello. For those not familiar, Mr. Zeppetello is a grad student whose first published research paper was misrepresented in service of climate change denial on social media, and had to go to great pains to sort of correct that in a big public way. And what his main takeaway was that while there are measures that can help reduce the risk of a similar situation, the main task really is to come to grips with both, and this is a quote pulled from the article, both the unprecedented dissemination of information and misinformation made possible by the internet demands that scientists and their institutions evolve to meet the public's growing appetite for credible science, while also acknowledging the political implications of their work. Because ultimately, we have a responsibility as scientists and science communicators to untangle fact from fiction and to communicate with society, because if we don't, others will fill that vacuum. If I can get, first, Gabriel, if I can get your thoughts on what skills you would encourage early career scientists to develop in the context of being prepared to both meet with the complexity of media and social media, and also to avoid that kind of mishap that poor Lucas had to deal with.
Sure. Yeah. No, that was a torturing story, actually. But I think one of the keys is to I agree with this idea of media training. I mean, scientists tend to think as communicators that, oh, I can get my paper out in the journal, and often and that's all that matters. And yeah, that matters a lot. But in that case is a good example of how that actually can spur misinformation that left unfettered will end up bolstering defenses that are completely wrong, right? Bolstering climate denialism. And so I have all of my students in my classes, for example, write press releases. So they'll read a paper, not necessarily their own, but when they're grad students, I actually have them write press releases of their own stuff. Whether their stuff ends up out in publication doesn't matter so much, but that's a way for you to tell your story in your voice. And again, if you're doing a real press release, granted, there's a media office who will also tinker with language and all that, because none of us are super good at communicating immediately. It's something, it's a learned skill, just like science writing is, but it's a skill that's, I think it's really critical, and some people are able to just do that very well. I'm glad that Alex is here. He has one of the most widely media cited papers in GeoHealth that we've ever had. It's because he's able to explain his story easily and in a very straightforward way. And I think that we have a tendency to think, oh, and you hear this a lot, like, well, I don't want to dumb down my science, which is exactly the wrong word to use about this. but it's effectively saying is you don't want to explain your science to normal human beings. No, you should want to explain them to normal human beings. They don't need to know your language. They don't need to know your acronyms, but they do need to know what your science is about, because we're being paid to do science. There's tremendous research funds being put to our research. Well, let's make sure the public understands what they're paying for.
Absolutely.
Well said. Catherine, same question.
I worry about stuff like this too, because every time you do an interview, you don't know how it's going to get edited. And I work in climate change science, so and I've had some letters like that. I think the trick oftentimes is when I think about issues of conflict in science like this, is to not try to always convince someone else that you're right. Right. So with evolution or with climate change in Americans, where there's an urge to try to want to like shove it down their throat almost. And a lot of times I think we need to take a little step back and just first show that scientists are people too, and that we're approachable and we're nice, and at least spark that initial moment in someone else's brain who's a denier that, hey, maybe scientists aren't so bad, maybe they're not awful people. And then maybe next time they encounter something, they're going to be a little bit more open to this idea of listening. So so that's what I always store in the back of my head, and kind of keep my fingers crossed a little bit that things won't be taken out of context, but we can't control everything. So you just have to put your best message together and then hope that it kind of stays intact as it goes out there.
I'd like to add something to that. Dr. Fabio Florindo, he couldn't be with us today, but he's our editor-in-chief of Reviews of Geophysics, and he sent us a list of points that he'd like to make. And I think that one of many very good ways of making your intent obvious is to make your research accessible by publishing in open access journals. And even if it's just a green open access journal, you can put the draft of your paper into a preprint archive or onto your institutional website. And the transparency helps quite a bit. So Dr. Florindo said that. I wanted him represented there.
I don't have much to add. Gabe made my point about press releases. It's crucial. I would only add a footnote to that, and that is that media affairs offices, particularly the AGUs, are extremely well prepared in seeing where the fallacies or the minefield is. In any paper that, they read the same news we read. And some of us are I know that Gabe and I are news junkies because I can see what he retweets. It's a lot of what I retweet. And like, okay, you saw that too, great. And, if you know what those discussions are and where the fallacies are and what's being exploited, then you can preempt those crises from happening, right? Not always, but I mean, sometimes it's insane. For example, the paper I think that Gabe was referring to was published, and if it weren't for the AGU and the fact that I coordinated 4 media affairs offices, this giant bot attack run from this natural news website, which is complete bogus, would have taken the story over, and they would have actually used my own language from the article to say that pollution, heavy pollution, particularly lead, only started with the Industrial Revolution, which was exactly the opposite of what I was saying in the article that was in GeoHealth. So you can get at this in multiple ways. One is to preempt the crisis by writing a solid, steeled press release, almost like a legal document, where you're basically preempting each and every scenario that crazy people, crazy deniers are going to. Sorry, they're not. I mean, they're people too. I'm just saying. And the other one is to use those media offices, and they have enormous lists of reporters, and they're your friends. There's one for each university that I work with. I work with 5, and all of them write their own press release, a version of what I do, and then they send it to their lists, and you just create a critical mass of good information that overcomes the bad, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of you overwhelm them. And the other thing I would suggest is that social media training is extremely helpful in that respect, because you have a network of people that you should be building day one of graduate school, if not earlier. And that network of people are going to be your friends, and they have a reach and they have authority, and they're going to be your collaborators in the future. And if something this bad happens, they can help you out. They're going to all say, hey, here's Alex with the real scoop on this. Everything else is, bogus. So I think that the community, maybe because of COVID, I feel that community that comes around social media, the scientific community, is very comforting in that way.
Thank you. Rodrigo, could I get your thoughts?
Yeah, so my colleagues have covered most points, but I would like just to add a few things. It's very important, I agree, to work with the media. It's very important to go to the press release offices, but to be an effective communicator with them and to help them to craft the story, I think it's very important to be aware of a few things. You need to understand very clear and communicate what is the problem that you're addressing. Yeah, what are the results and what are the implications of those things. If you cannot articulate that to the journalists, it will be very difficult for them to translate what is your message. So this gets me to the final point, which is a simple technique. It's like when you address a reporter, and this is more than just the journalist for the reporters from the university, like a real journalist looking for different points of view. To avoid misunderstanding, you have to reiterate your message. It has to be very simple, but repeat your message. And in order to be effective, you need to know what is that message. What is the message that is going to resonate with the people? And again, going back to the previous discussion, is see what people think about a certain word. Go and look at the images. What is the discussion about that to avoid misunderstanding? But repeat your message. Have it very clear. And that is an exercise that we have to do ahead of time, not to be caught in the moment to be misinterpreted. Yeah, if that's the case.
Thank you. Yeah, this is great. I think what I really appreciate about this particular panel is that we have a lot of very diverse kind of life experiences and skill sets. We've got editors and authors on this, which is very interesting, as we were talking a little bit before the panel. And to that end, actually, I have a question specifically for the editors, for Gabe and Rodrigo. If I can ask, what are some common mistakes you see often that people make in terms of making their work accessible? And how would you advise, particularly early career scientists, but really any researcher, how would you advise avoiding these common pitfalls?
Rodrigo, why don't you go first, because I went first last time.
Okay. So I think it's very important to share with the public the philosophy of AGGU for accessibility on data and the information that we share, scientists, that may be different from other journals. So AGGU requires to have your data available with your paper. So a very simple mistake that people do is they don't include their data in the publication. And that is especially just a no for as an entry point in the editorial process. That is it's important because it adds transparency, replicability of the information. So that is a technical issue that some authors just oversee or don't consider that very important. I've seen people that will put a link and it's not active. You can disclaim that, in the editor is going to be active once the paper is published, but we have to see as from an editorial approach that you are willing to follow the AGGU policies, but also that you are proactive on this. In terms of communication from an editorial perspective, communicating your science, another mistake that we see sometimes is overselling your story. You want to provide things as factual issues. Sometimes it goes a little bit on the other side, but you depend on the review process and on your experience as an editor to make those calls. And in some cases, there are just simply naive issues where the author may not be just got excited about the results, and we have to organize those things. In some cases are wrong conclusions, and you hope that the review process is going to help you with that. And in other cases are fantastic discoveries that you actually want to highlight that as an editor, and AGU has an opportunity as an editor to write highlights. So we can actually go and say, hey, the community, look at this thing, because it's going to be super, super cool. And you help them in sharing their findings.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just to add a little bit on in terms of as an editor, how do I judge? The first thing I judge when examining the accessibility of a paper that comes in or an article is can I, from the title and abstract alone, understand the basic points of what they're trying to get across, right? Because that's what all the readers are going to do. They're going to look at the title and the abstract, and if neither of them make any sense, they're not going to read on, even if it's a free. Even if it's a gold open access. And what I find is that a lot of especially early career people, we put ourselves behind this wall of science, the science wall. So we are scientists, so we tend to write in a different way that's often very jargon filled and tons of passive voice and all of the things that work against comprehension and accessibility of a paper. And I find that sometimes reviewers will actually reinforce that. They'll say, "Oh, this part wasn't, quote unquote, scientific enough, or it was too conversational." And I'm thinking, my goodness, I wish more of our papers were conversational in nature. So those are the things I view. And granted, there's some difficulty sometimes with non-native speakers of English, for example. It can be hard to write a compelling title, especially titles for some reason. I think it's very language specific. Nevertheless, AGU is there to help out, and even we work with authors a lot on making sure that their papers are highlighted where appropriate, as Rodrigo said, and also we fiddle around. I insist that the highlights that are included in papers and something called a plain language summary are actually readable and understandable, and not just a copy and paste from the abstract.
Thank you. All right, next one is for our authors, for Alex and Catherine. I'm going to start with Catherine. What role would you say the accessibility of science plays in how we address major challenges like climate change or COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think climate change, and at least in the United States and COVID in the United States, just really highlights how important it is that we figure out how to do a better job of communicating our science to the general public. There's a lot of different ways to learn how to get better at this, and a lot of it is not feeling like you have to hide behind the science. One of the first things to be able to do is be able to explain, why care? Why should someone care about your science? So figuring out how to make how to talk about the work that you do in a way that it's meaningful, that someone else should care about it. And part of that, I think, for us as scientists, we're trained to be so careful about accuracy and precision and all of this other stuff that we forget that other people might not care at that 95% level or whatever, right? And we get very uncomfortable stepping outside the box to things that are implications of our results or whatever. And we need to do a little bit better job of that, I think, because a lot of times those really profound things that we find are really implications of our results. And then more science gets done based on those to further test those. So the rigorous process of science continues, but we have to be able to connect what we do to why someone should care about it as sort of a very first step.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I worked in government as well as, just being a citizen and being a consumer of scientific information that is not in my bailiwick. And in government, if something cannot be explained the first 30 seconds and you can't add an appropriation to it, you're dead. It's useless. So, I think what Gabe said and what Catherine reinforced, that you can't be scared of being wrong. And that doesn't mean that you're going to be wrong. I'm just saying that you can use language to be clear without being obscure, without using jargon, and use conditionals or use, oh, this is the first. No, this is one of the first. There you go. You're not making any claim there of primacy of any kind. And still, you have some punch there. Just those small things, small adjustments that can really deliver the message, still with some sensationalism that everybody wants these days in the media. And certainly, one of the questions that, one of the ways that you answer, why should I care, is, well, you should care because this is really big news. And, it's one of the first, and it's really cool, as Rodrigo was saying, this is really cool stuff. But also, you can really make it count and make it current. The rules of public relations, stay current, stay clear. Those are that's the bottom line. If you don't do that, then I remember when I started graduate school, and I was a pretty nerdy undergrad to begin with, and then I got to Harvard and I got into the next level, and I thought, yeah, these guys are really interesting and intelligent, but nobody's gonna know what they're talking about, and I'm not here to waste my time. I'm not a tree that's gonna fall in the forest. I want my work to matter. I want it to not gather dust on a shelf. So, I get enormous motivation from that. I don't know about you guys. And of course, because we work on climate and health, at least me, it's the convergence of two crises, and who wants to shy away from that?
Well said. Well said. I wanted to circle back around to an observation Gabe made earlier about authors who may not speak English as a first language. First, I'm going to start with Catherine. What challenges do translation pose? In this case, as an author, how does, say, linguistic nuance, cultural context, and other such factors complicate the question of accessibility?
I think that, a lot of my experience with this has been on these big international teams, and you've got multiple people writing, and it does make it more complicated to figure out what the message is supposed to be when people are kind of approaching the same story from different sort of language perspectives. So I don't know that I have a real solution for this, but I think anyone that collaborates starts to see, if you have multiple writers, you're seeing different voices show up in the document, and it's very common to get reviewer comments about that, actually, and then to try to go back and figure out how to retain the original voices, but yet have the overall language seem similar. So I don't think I answered your question, but I think it's because I don't actually know the answer, how to really work with this. So
Totally understandable. I think both in general and in the context of scientific communication, it is wonderful to be able to admit, I don't know, but I can. And yeah, I think that's a big part of intellectual honesty and of learning. Rodrigo, could I get your perspective on this question?
Yeah, thank you. So English is not my first language. And I did face that situation. It was very hard, very, very, very hard. first, I want to point out there that from an editorial perspective and an author perspective, I don't think it's constructive when a reviewer said, "Oh, this is poorly written. This is bad science." It's true that there are papers that are poorly written, but that doesn't mean that it's bad science. Now, if you cannot communicate your science, then you open a lot of questions, and that creates a problem in the review process. But just because you are not able to write, that should not disqualify anyone as to be a good or a bad scientist, because you are making an effort to communicate in your second or third or fourth languages. In my case, I speak 3 different languages. That said, the way we communicate in science at AGGU, this meeting and many meetings, is in English. And with that, it comes also not only the challenge of creating phrases from a language perspective, but also a cultural perspective. And this is very difficult in communication, because the way we communicate in a society in different cultures is very different than the way we communicate, let's say in this context, AGGU, in the American Geophysical Union, meaning the United States style. And that is cultural, because in many countries, in many cultures, it's very hard to make a statement as we do it in English. Say, we're talking about titles, no? The titles have to capture the essence of the paper and have to be engaging. True, absolutely. But for some cultures, putting that out there could sound as that you are overselling, that you are being arrogant. And that goes against the cultural perspective. So everything is toned down, or the way it's communicated something is very, 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 very complicated, because that direct message, if you say that way from a cultural perspective, may be perceived as aggressive. So when I work with colleagues in Latin America, I try to make that point that we have to really switch the channel from the Latin American perspective, how we communicate science, how can we communicate ourselves, and try to understand how we communicate in English and how we communicate the science in this universal language, in this universal scientific understanding. And I think in the past it was more complicated, but I think the new generations are getting that. And I think they're getting that because they are getting more exposed through internet, media, etc., seeing how communication is being done. And they are, I believe that they are getting the feeling of how to better communicate that in this science world. But it's a very important issue that as an editor, I'm very aware when I receive papers from not native English speakers, how to help them to make the point that they are trying to do, not to be going around, because it might be a cultural thing, not because it's a communication in terms of English per se issue.
Thank you. Gabe, same question.
Well, Rodrigo's perspective is really valuable, I think. And I wasn't, and it's not to say that that it's only non-native English speakers who write bad titles. You know, I look through my own students' papers, and sometimes I spend a lot of time on titles. But I think that that it's true. And I think that the usual way that a lot of us native English speakers view papers when we first do review is some of this circular, what Rodrigo's saying about going around, that it was, you know, knee jerk is like, oh, that's bad writing. Well, no, that's probably just a kind of a cultural way of writing. And so I always have to decouple that from my brain a little bit. But I agree also with Rodrigo that younger generations, I think they just have so much more exposure to colloquial English. And so they can meld that with their scientific English that they learn in school and turn in pretty solid stuff. But one thing that Rodrigo said resonated with me a lot is when a reviewer simply discounts a paper scientifically because it's not written well. It could be that it's not written well and it's bad science. I'm not saying that, but that can be really frustrating from an editor's perspective, because we see the value in the paper, but it's also not our job to copy, edit, and English translate papers. So it's a frustrating experience. And for reviewers, I just hope you're a little bit more open to the fact that they fiddle with the English later. If there's points that aren't making sense to you because the writing is bad, well, just flag those, right? but start looking at the science first, and if there's valuable science, and I see a lot of papers with really valuable science, but frankly, they're not presented that well. Like as Alex said, maybe their figures are terrible, or their writing is bad, and that's an opportunity for me then to engage in a conversation with the authors, and to help work through what they have to do. I don't rewrite their papers for them. That's also not any of our jobs, but nevertheless, important to treat their science with respect. So I'll just end it at that.
All right, thank you. And Alex, can I get your thoughts?
Sure. Oddly, my first language is not English either. I grew up in southern Italy and Greece, so my first two languages are completely different. I was self-taught, and one of the things I had to learn when I came here and started undergrad was what an argument was. Because in Italy, growing up, you could write 15 pages handwritten. As long as they were logical and beautiful, you got an A. So the argument, and you know, you read a lot of Italian literature, I mean scientific literature, it's very descriptive. French is very similar. So I don't know if Latin America, I'm sorry, I haven't read that much Latin American science, but you know, maybe 20% of all overall. But I don't know if that is a major issue, but certainly they err on the side of descriptive rather than argumentative. And that's definitely the major issue, right? I think that descriptive is great. It's great for reviewer essays, especially, but argumentative is where we make progress. So I think that you can't prescient from that problem. You can't just overcome that problem. But you can overcome where you can overcome the problem, and I certainly did early on, was in using figures as your friend. If anything isn't clear in your text, I know from you know my postdoc advisors from many years ago and other advisors before, when they did reviews, if they ever did, they always looked at the figures first. When they reviewed my papers, they always looked at the figures first. And if they couldn't get it from the figures, they wouldn't even read the text, right? They'd just be, yeah, whatever, not clear enough. And that's where my probably most valuable skill as a scientist comes in, and that is knowing Photoshop. I can do figures that nobody else can, or very, very few other people can. My graduate students do the same thing. They now all use Illustrator, and you know, you just one up your figures in such a way. And there are books about how you convey this information visually, right? I forget the author, but there's one particular book about this that's very good. And you know, if the figures blow it out of the park and really clarify your data very, you know, at first glance, then the text, however difficult, can be managed. If you got figures that are completely unclear and the text that's also unclear, then you know, as a writer, I mean, now I think of English as my first language, but as a writer, I think, you know, you're really in trouble. So I think figures are a good way to help yourself. And then reading a lot of other scientific literature, unfortunately. I hate the fact that we have to use the passive voice. I almost never use it. But sometimes it's just the way it is.
All right. Next question.
John, before we move on, I'd like to make one more point that Fabio did. He suggested, he highlighted the overall importance of having a personal website where you describe your research. And I think that this is important universally, but it's also important if you want to reach people who do not speak the language that the publisher publishes in or that the paper is written in. So if you write your personal language and the descriptions of your research in Italian, in Spanish, and French, you have an entire new audience to direct to your papers.
Thank you. So my next question is about FAIR data principles. For anyone in the audience who may not be aware, FAIR stands for findable, accessible, and interoperable. These are the data standards that are a requirement for publication in AGU journals. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on how they contribute to accessibility in our work. Gabriel, can we start with you?
I think Earth scientists are just grappling with this now, this issue now. I think that we've always felt that, putting our PDF of an Excel file or of Excel image is good enough for data, but obviously now we know it's not. I have been, a lot of my academic childhood was with the ocean drilling program, where discoverability was key, and so even from early days, they grappled with this successfully. And then, I migrated over to, I was an advisory board member for one of the Lamont programs that was funded by the NSF on the various databases. There's a petrography database called PetDB and a geochemistry database. But I've become, increasingly convinced that that this accessibility is going to be the key for maintaining some of our relevance and transparency. Having said that, I think that it's easy enough for a person or a group to set up a website and just do big data dumps and say, look, my data is discoverable, when in fact we know it's often not. And furthermore, I actually happen to work in a field where not all data can be discoverable. I work with a lot of human subjects, patient data, which is protected by federal law in the US, and it's also protected in individual countries by their various laws. So there's a certain limit to discoverability or limit to the legality of it. And this also comes with people who work with oil company data or other corporate data, right? Nevertheless, I think it's really key. Having said that, as an author and an editor, boy, it's a pain in the butt to comply with the new data rules. So, and I think that's because AGU, it's great that the AGU is ahead on this game. I think they're really ahead on this game. But I think we're still working out how best to do it, which is completely fine. I think we're in the bit of the growing pains phase.
I think you're absolutely right about that, in my experience. All right, Rodrigo.
Yeah. So I personally, I'm passionate about fair data principles, but I want to touch base on two things. One, in the principles where AGU is a signatory of this effort in earth system science to make data fair. But then also going back to the cultural aspect. So from an AGU perspective, an editorial perspective, I think is the right thing to do for transparency, for reproducibility, for interoperability, for replicability, which is basically the fair data principles. I know that editors, authors have been having trouble on that, and in part is because it's something relatively new. So the Orelly asked now to do this, and this is something that not every journal asks. It's optional in many journals. So I think is a great effort to be an example for the future that the AGU is putting. I do believe that's the right thing to do. How difficult it is to do this? It's depending on your data. So if you have a small data set that you can put it in a simple Excel file, there is really no reason why not to archive it. There are many ways to put it there. An AGU has a fantastic list of repositories that follow FAIR principles. Just to name a few, it could be just Fixtures, a typical one, and it's free. You get a DOI and it's there. The problem of doing it by yourself is that it's easy to create a DOI, but not necessarily you're doing it the right way. So this is something that may bite us in the community in the future, because we may have DOIs, but the data is not necessarily going to be organized in the same way. And we can spend a whole day chatting about how to submit data, etc. But that's something that's a discussion that we may have in 10 years from now and see what we are doing it right as a community. But it's more complicated when you're talking about petabytes of information. That in some cases, some projects have that. But in that, you usually have support from agencies. And the United States national labs and federal agencies have support for that, and there is possible to do that. Although if you are not sponsored by those agencies, then it will be complicated to put gigabytes of information on the internet. But it's possible, and I think that community is moving forward through that. But going back to the cultural aspect, again, I see a difference between the younger generation and the call it the older generation, and this is because many senior scientists, they were not exposed to data sharing. So now you're asking these authors to share the data. So it is really a cultural shock as how I do it and why should I do it. And sometimes I have seen this shock of no, I don't want to do this for many reasons. And then the younger generations, they are, yes, where do I post it? Why? Because they are in Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, they're sharing everything. So, oh, I share my data, of course, where do I put that? No, that's a cultural aspect that I think is good for science. But also in the cultural aspect, going through other countries where science is, let's call it, more difficult to do, where resources are limited in terms of human resources or economic resources. So data becomes an asset, no, a power, an asset that you can give you control for more publications, etc. So asking these researchers to get away all the data for one publication, it's very difficult for them. So culturally becomes an issue of, I am going to give you something that took me a decade to do, and I don't know if I will ever do it again. And that creates a lot of conflict where they know there's the right thing to do, but they are just not ready to do that. And that is something that as editors and as a scientific community, we have to be aware, because you fight this balance between what it should be fair and the right thing to do, fair meaning the fair principles and the right thing to do, but on the other hand is understanding how difficult it is for some people to do this, and you might be putting them in a very difficult situation, and we can talk a lot about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's clearly a very complex problem with a lot of different intersecting factors. Alex, can I get your perspective?
Boy, my perspective, I'm going to be a slightly more controversial. Sorry, I'm Italian. I think a lot of people should get over themselves and post the damn data. I have had the worst time collecting data that should have been out there for decades. I totally understand the postdoc, because I've been there, who wants to protect data that they collected. You know, they climbed top of Everest and got the core, and they, you know, we're the only one who have the laser system to use it and do it. And okay, give them an embargo of 2 years or whatever. Or, you know, choose a non-fair journal, whatever you want. But the article, as an example, the article I just published with GeoHealth last September, which went viral everywhere about the Spanish flu, besides having the first, for the first time, highly resolved glaciochemical record from an ice core, it also had public health records from all of Europe, from 13 countries, from a century ago. Mortality records. The same exact thing we look at every day in the New York Times or the Johns Hopkins dashboard or whichever one, you know, with a timeline underneath, and, you know, your spikes in mortality. All of the literature on this particular pandemic, the Spanish flu, usually really covers age distribution, not time, which is a big problem for environmental health people, because we think about seasons and weather and climate. But here's the kicker. There was no data set for that mortality data anywhere. 100 years have passed. There are no privacy issues. There's nothing. There are multiple articles and no data anywhere. I've emailed every single author. No one ever got back to me. So what did I do? I went to Widener Library and got the original government records and tabulated them and translated them, transcribed them one by one for 13 countries for each week of 2 years. And now that data is on the GeoHealth website, and you can get it. It's the only place that data is available in the world. You want to make a comparison between COVID and the Spanish flu? That's the only place it is. How is that? I mean, how many articles have not been written because of that? You know, how many graduate students just gave up? Not everybody's got the Widener library. And you know how many times I've reached out to colleagues, co-authors even, right? On the same paper, hey, could you send me that data set so I can have this figure? No, they send you the 256 kilobyte figure that I can't possibly fit into my article because it's too low resolution, and they will now give you the data set. I'm sorry, no, it's not okay. This is science. No, especially in public health. I mean, we're working for a higher purpose here. It's not, you know, I understand the academics. Hell, I was on the job market for 4 years. I totally understand what you're trying to protect. But no, I think FAIR is the standard we should all follow. You know, if we want to build some embargoes to protect careers, early career people, sure, no problem. There is such a thing for dissertations. We can do the same for data sets, no problem. I don't know how long that would be. An ethics panel can figure it out, but no, it's just so limiting. And with the crisis of reproducibility that is often attributed to some of our fields, you want that data out there. Now, whether it's going to be good data or it's going to be, you know, data that is being fudged with in order to, I mean, I think that's also, you know, I don't want to open that can of worms, but there are some people whose data doesn't match what they say in the articles sometimes. And then, you know, I've seen articles reported in the New York Times. Oh, he has a resolution of 50 data points per year. You look at a data set, 1 data point per year. Like, I mean, I've declined to comment on those papers because what am I going to say? He's lying?
Yeah, exactly. It's a difficult position. Okay. Catherine, can I get your thoughts on
I can
FAIR?
build on a little bit what Alex said, because, you know, a lot of the work that I have done, the coolest work that I've done, the work that has gotten the international coverage that is in the New York Times and BBC and blah, blah, is the work that is synthesis work, right? And because that's what's exciting. You pull it all together into like a big, cool story that, you know, is interesting at a global scale. And so everyone can find their little story in there. It's not something that just happened in the Midwest. So, which is where I live, which is very boring. And I haven't gone anywhere for months now. So, but I have been shocked at how challenging it is for researchers who want to participate and join these projects as collaborators to get their data together and get it organized. And I think, you know, this is like that long tail of dark data that we talk about, where data is just going to disappear. And so one of the fantastic things about FAIR data is really just that it's going to ensure that somewhere this stuff is recorded in a way that hopefully will make it a little bit more useful than wherever it is right now, right? And it is time consuming. It is hard for people to put their data together, to go back and get their old data and organize it in a way that's, you know, useful. And so I do hope that funding agencies recognize that this is something that requires people, effort, time, and are willing to pay to support data managers increasingly in labs or in departments, you know, institutions to support them in departments, because otherwise the data does get lost, you know, and then that's a shame.
If I can add a very small addendum to that, it's first of all, God bless NOAA and paleoclimate database that has survived 4 years of total attacks. But you know, when I don't know, I'm sure that others here on the panel, no offense to those who were happy and celebrating on January 20th, 2017, but I was downloading all the data that I could possibly want because I was afraid that it was going to disappear. And you know, the fact that if we start creating FAIR data verses, usually it's what they're called. I don't know what else we call them, but you know, clouds, data clouds. then that doesn't become an issue anymore. Never had I thought that that would be an issue, but it is an issue that a lot of data disappeared from the EPA and other places like that. And you know, we can't have that. That just can't happen.
Absolutely. All right, I want to bring us to our final question. As scientists and science communicators, how can we best encourage and empower the next generation of writers, researchers, and leaders to be scientifically literate? Rodrigo, if you can start us off.
Wow, that's a good question. How can we empower them? I guess start reading. You know, start reading and see. Pick your who you admire. You know? I think that is something that you have to identify first. I mean, how we learn from our teachers, you know, our mentors. So identify maybe someone that you admire how is communicating, and in that case, cultivate your strengths. Some of us may have some strengths for data analysis. Some maybe some strengths for extension, no, for communication with different audiences. I think it's rare to find someone that can communicate to every single sector of the society. There are a few examples, but recognizing which are your strengths and focus on those. I don't think every person that goes to grad school needs to be a university professor, no. If you are maybe got a PhD in science and then want to go to science communication, that's fantastic because we know more people with those skills. Identify what is your passion. If you want to go to policy, translating science into policy, another fantastic skill, super needed. I had the chance to work on some policy reports, and it's very different how you communicate with Congress and instead of communicating with peers. Learn how to be influential with your peers, how to be influential with the public, and how to be influential also with the policy making. Is that something that you have some implications? That is a skill, and by definition, a skill is something that you can learn. Practice, and I guess it's not be afraid of failure, right? We're going to make mistakes, and the first way to start is by trying. No, it's a big leap, but that's the way we can start.
Well said. Gabriel.
Yeah, I would say one of the ways is to read science journalism, to read how our science is written by journalists, to give us a view of how our science can best be consumed by the public, where I think it should reside. And if you're in a position of teaching, teach through science journalism. I do that a lot. I don't just have students read the source reference. I often have them read the journalistic piece too. Learn, as Rodrigo said, follow your favorite science communicator. Learn what they've had to do to save being a good science communicator and a good scientist. Write press releases and tweets of your own work. And also finally consider writing in the popular press. We have a nice bridge science journal. It's not really a journal, it's called The Conversation, where they try to translate science into public consumption. And I've written about, I think, 5 pieces for that. And in fact, probably my most read piece, it's read by over 500,000 people so far, was in The Conversation. So I know I had more impact on that one paper than I've had in any of my geeky peer-reviewed stuff. So yeah, I would say broaden your perspective of what science is and how you relay that to the public.
Thank you. Catherine?
I would say make yourself accessible, first of all, as a person. So you are not a scientist in an ivory tower. And then I would say, in just doing that, you will make your science more accessible because you will become more approachable. Find ways to get training and practice. Yes, and improv skills are a great way to help you develop how to have conversations where you don't feel like this conversation is going to get out of control, where you feel like you can still get your message across and you don't feel so stressed out about being wrong. So learning how to listen and really engage in conversations with other people helps do a lot of those things a lot, and then practicing a lot. I mean, communication is two-way, it's listening and talking, and it, gets better with practice. So the more we can practice it ourselves and encourage our students to practice it, the more people will get better at talking about science.
I hope so. Thank you. Alex.
I can't really add much to what my esteemed colleagues and friends already said. That's really it. So I'll be the oddball again and tell you a couple of things that I think few of us practice anymore. Perhaps it's beaten out of us. But one is humor. Everybody wants to laugh, and if you can make reporters laugh, and you can make your public laugh, you've accomplished something amazing. And, a lot of the things we talk about are pretty gloomy. So one key thing we can do is for people to actually listen to us is not make them so gloomy all the time, or, tactfully make fun of it and try to engage people that way. Because otherwise we're just the Debbie Downers, as SNL calls them, right? We're just the constant downer on or the doomers, as some other people call us. The other thing is art. I don't know how many of us use this, but I use art all the time. I just finished teaching a course on art and environmental communications and climate science and public health, because every article about your work is going to have a giant header photo at the top of it that has nothing to do with your work, and you can make it about you if you just feed it to the reporter, who is otherwise going to go to iStock Photo and pick up whatever they already paid for, that is completely unrelated with your article, and that's going to cover every, if you're successful at outreach, it's going to be everywhere, and it's got nothing to do with you. In most cases, it's inaccurate. It's an inaccurate photo. So, for example, the Audubon Society published an article on the same day or the same week as my last one on GeoHealth, on how birds carry H1N1 and other strains of viruses, which is one of the arguments I was making in the journal. And it was beautiful. That article was gorgeous. It had an animation at the top. I was like, oh, I wish this were my article. And it's incredibly important, really incredibly important. Choose photos that are beautiful. We don't have to be shy about engaging the public on more than one level. That's just more than intellectual, that's more emotional, or that's more about beauty. And we are humans, we're talking to humans, and there's nothing wrong about doing that. So that's definitely, those are the two things. And cite art too. I used a poem. I cited a poem in my last article by suffragette and nurse during World War I, because I couldn't have described it better than she did. And then you can use that for social media, which I did. And read people who are amazed by nature. If you're working on climate, people like Mary Oliver or E.O. Wilson, or people who can really convey it, and that'll make your writing better. I do that all the time. So I don't know. That's the oddball add-on, I suppose.
Thank you. I'm a very big fan of both Mary Oliver and E.O. Wilson's work, so I definitely appreciate the oddball response.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're a little bit over, but I wanted to wrap things up with a Raymond Chandler quote, because I was reminded of his work when you talked about the importance of art. Because so often throughout this panel, we come back to the importance of establishing a human connection with your audience, whether that is identifying what it is about your work that makes you passionate and may bring them in, identifying who your audience is in the sense of what kind of communication will reach them, and identifying who your audience is as far as remembering that they are human and remembering to convey that you, the scientists in the white coat, are also a human. So I want to close out with, there are two kinds of truth: the truth that lights the way and the truth that warms the heart. The first of these is science and the second is art. And I think ultimately this panel, judging from our discussion, we can all agree that those two are not all at odds.
Definitely. Very well said.
Thank you for your
Thank
time,
you very
everyone.
much.
I think if we want to take a second for questions, I'll open the floor briefly.
Hey, oh, sorry. Hey, Sean. Yes, yes. Now he's in the recording. We don't have any questions, actually, so I think we can wrap it up.
Oh, look at that. Well, all right. In that case, thank you again so much for your time and for your insights in this discussion.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
organizing it. And so good to see you all. Hopefully soon to see you all in person.
Yeah, here's hoping.
Thank you, guys.
All right.
care.
Thanks again,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.